introduce our speaker. We have Jonathan Miller here, Director of the IRB, and he is going to talk to us about consenting issues. Next week, we are going to do a new kind of twist on things. It's going to be consenting practice, and I'm not quite sure what all Penny has in mind, but it's a little bit of case study, hands-on kind of activity. So hopefully you can learn. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Do you want me to speak into the microphone?
No, she said you're good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, hello. I'm glad to get the opportunity to speak to you all. A lot of familiar faces in the room. Some of you I probably know your names, but don't have the face yet. So feel free to stick around after and come chat, introduce yourself. I'd love to get to know you. Yeah, Penny asked me to talk about informed consent, something that obviously everyone in this room is familiar with. So first, I have no conflicts that I need to disclose here. Here's what we're going to talk about. What is informed consent? What are the definitions that we're talking about so that we can get on the same page? Why is it important? What are some of the challenges involved in that? You need to give me that talk. What are the challenges that you face and how we can help you? Some tips and some resources that we have available for you to use. So what are we talking about with informed consent? So first, it's an information exchange. It's a conversation between you and the participant. The regulations say legally effective informed consent. So a lot of times we just shorten it to consent, but to get consent, there has to be information there, that adequate information for the individual to make an informed decision. Remember that it's a process, it's not a form, so it's not just, here's this form, sign this. It's that conversation that you're having. That's the consent process. Participants should have sufficient opportunity to consider whether or not to participate. An opportunity and a process that minimizes coercion and undue influence. Understandable language, that could be, are they Spanish speaking? It could be what reading level are they on, what level of education, how technical is the language that you're giving them, how much of a just one-on-one conversation do you need to have with them outside of just the written form. And one thing that I really want to stress is that consent is obtained from a participant. It's not done to a participant. So it's that conversation that you have. And I know it's semantics to some extent, but it's something that I want us to keep in mind, that we're not doing something to the participant. We're having a conversation with them and asking them to give us their consent. So we're obtaining their consent. So I wanted to break down, there's common confusion between what is consent and what is documentation of consent. This is particularly important when we're talking about waivers, what kind of form you need to fill out. Well, I'm doing it over the phone, so I can't get consent. No, you can't get a signature, right? You can still get consent. So, it could be a paper form, something on an iPad, it could be a video, it could be a phone conversation, it could be an intro paragraph on an online survey, it could be an information sheet, it could be a brochure. That's the information. So those are the elements of consent. Regulations break these out separately. The elements of consent in 46.116 versus the signature, that's the documentation of consent. So if you're familiar with our forms, we have the waiver of consent, and we're not going to throw authorization in here. Probably many of you in the room are covered entities and have to deal with HIPAA authorizations too right now. Just lump consent and authorization together and separate that from documentation. So the information you're getting is consent. So if you can't get consent for whatever reason, you're doing a chart review of 1,000 patients, you can't practically obtain consent from all of those individuals. That's the elements of consent. Separate from that, if you're doing a phone survey or an online survey, you can't get their signature. That's the documentation of consent. So keep that in mind. A lot of times we talk about if you're just doing an anonymous survey, perhaps, you wouldn't want to get their signature on it, so we say you're giving them an information sheet. The information sheet has all the basic elements of consent that are defined in the regulations. So this is a quote from Henry Beecher in the 60s. An experiment is ethical or not at its inception. If it's not become ethical post hoc, ends do not justify means. And so we have to put all of the ethical principles that we talk about in human subjects research together. Respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Respect for persons being what we're talking about today, the consent process, giving someone an opportunity to agree to participate in their study. So we can't take out part of this. and have an ethical study. So that's one of the reasons that consent, informed consent, voluntary informed consent is imperative to have ethical human subjects research. Who's done this study? So it says therapies, benefits, harms, risks. I know that probably everyone in this room conducts very complicated research. And it's not always easy to get all that information down on a form. And so that's part of what we're going to talk about today is how do we practically do this? How do we get this information across to participants? Facebook, all right? It's surprising to me how often I see on my news feed posts from friends popping up about participating in research, particularly research here at UAB, but research other places as well. So I'm going to talk about a couple of studies that I've seen friends post about. And as the director of the IRB, a lot of my friends don't really know what I'm doing. You can tell them I'm the director of the IRB. They don't really, a lot of times when I introduce myself, I'll say, if they ask me what I do, I'm the director of the IRB, and I'll look, is there a glimmer of recognition there, or is there not? And if they do know what I do, I'll say, don't hold it against me. That means you dealt with the IRB. So a couple of examples here. The first one is from a friend who does Ironman competitions. And in her first Ironman, which if you're not familiar with Ironman triathlons, it's a swim, bike, run, 2.4 mile swim, 112 mile bike ride, and a full marathon, 26.2 mile run, all within a 17-hour cutoff. If you come in 17:01, you're disqualified. You don't have an Ironman. So in my friend's first Ironman, during the swim, she experienced pulmonary edema. She started coughing up blood. Now, when you're in the middle of an ocean swim, that's not exactly the time that you want to start coughing up blood. So to put that amount of training into something, obviously you're very invested in it. And she was, and so she finished the triathlon, but she wanted to know what's going on here. Why did she experience this? So she actually sought out an investigator conducting research in this area. And researched him, contacted him, asked to be part of his study, traveled several hours. It wasn't a study here, traveled several hours there to participate in a study where they would place her in a tank of ice water for long periods of time, all kinds of things trying to induce this pulmonary edema, trying to see what are the factors that cause this. So obviously this is someone who is very invested in this, put this kind of training in it, in her physical fitness, but also in the research itself. She sought them out. And so I called her up and asked her if she would just tell me what was her experience with the consent process. So I was curious about this. And these were some of the things that she said, some of the comments. Did I really know what was going on? Probably not. Now this is somebody who was very interested in this, had done lots of research on the condition in and of itself, personally invested, sought the researchers out, went to them, wasn't recruited. Did she know what was going on? Probably not. She said the more pictures, the better in the consent form. Graphs not helpful, conversation was. And I didn't ask her to elaborate on that, but I think she might have tables instead of graphs. She said, I would have signed whatever. She just wanted to be part of the research. Had we been in the room much longer, I wouldn't have heard anything else anyway. Can anybody relate to that? Genetic testing is the only part I engaged in. And I did ask her to elaborate on that. She said that's the only time she was asked to make a decision. Was here are some check boxes, yes or no. What is your option here? What does this mean? And so she had to think about it. So that to me shows that it is important to have those check boxes for certain parts, for optional sub-studies and things that are very important. This is probably the most telling thing that she said. She mentioned the PowerPoint, the conversation, pictures. She never mentioned the form. In our whole conversation, I think we talked on the phone for an hour. She never mentioned the form. And I even asked her at the end, I was like, oh, by the way, did they, was there a form? Form? Like that, the paper was unimportant to her, the information was. Another thing that I saw pop up on the newsfeed, and this was research here at UAB, that I thought was really interesting. It was a study where participants got body composition testing and got the results back. And so I was, at the time, a member of a certain CrossFit gym located about 6 blocks away, I think, and a mile as we run because I'm tired. And so it was funny. I just sat back and watched. I wasn't going to, hey, I know all about this study, or I could pull the file and check it out. And it was funny that there was probably 60 some odd comments under this post. And really probably what most of them were interested in, these were all my friends. And I did ask them after, I asked the person they personally posted, do you mind if I talk about this? And the thing that they were most interested in is what would be done, did they have to have pictures of themselves taken in their underwear, and what would be done with those pictures? It's reasonable, right? There's a privacy aspect there, confidentiality aspect there. So they were really interested in that. I've also had the opportunity to observe some consent processes since I've been here in this role, particularly some oncology trials that I observed the consent process in. The issue of therapeutic misconception, somebody comes in with a lab coat and a stethoscope around their neck and a clipboard, and you're there as a patient, and you think, I'm here for treatment, I'm here, So part of the consent process, one of the things that this individual obtaining consent asked was, what is the purpose of the study? And the comments were like, to make me better, to cure the cancer. This was a phase 1 trial. So, you can get into the benefits of participating in a phase 1 trial, but we all know that the main point of a phase 1 trial is not to cure. It's there are other very important goals there, but cure is not really is not it. Now, a lot of people do participate out of altruism. They may fully realize that they're not going to benefit from the study, but they're doing it to help others down the road. I had an aunt who had breast cancer and participated in studies, and she said, I know it's not going to help me, but if it'll help my daughter 20 years from now, it's worth it. This was comments from the individual obtaining consent. Most of them will do whatever you say. It's kind of like my friend before, just I'll sign wherever, I just want to be a part of it. They just want to get better, where do I sign? So I see lots of nodding in the room, probably those of you who obtain consent can probably relate to that. Other challenges in obtaining consent. Average literacy is about an 8th grade level. Well, if the average is 8th grade, that means there are many who are below 8th grade. So that's going to be a challenge. How do you bridge the gap there with those? Obviously, your work is cut out for you. And then patients forget 40 to 80% of the medical information that they receive immediately. So again, your work is cut out for you. And remember that consent is a process. It's not a one-time event. It's not a form. It's a process. So as you see these patients over and over, remind them, have conversations with them, answer their questions. The consent process is documented on that first time when they do sign the form, but consent continues after that as you're answering their questions and as new information becomes available. This is another quote from Henry Beecher from the 60s. Ethical errors are increasing not only in numbers but in variety. For example, in the recently added problems arising in transplantation of organs. Just because there are ethical issues in obtaining consent or in the research we do, does that mean that we shouldn't do the research? No. I mean, I have a friend whose very young child had to have a heart transplant. Are we grateful that that research was conducted in the 60s that presented ethical issues? Absolutely we are. But today we have, obviously we're continuing to have advancing technologies that create additional ethical issues. One of those is internet research. How do we deal with this? This is a quote from a journal article about research conducted observing a breast cancer support group that was conducted online. So the researchers were just lurking, just watching what played out there. And the participants found out about it. And so one in particular said, when I joined this, I thought it would be a support group, not a fishbowl for a bunch of guinea pigs. I certainly don't feel at this point that it is a safe environment as a support group is supposed to be, and I will not open myself up to be dissected by students or scientists. And one thing that this points out is that ethical harms are not just physical. That the harms that you as researchers, as investigators, as people obtaining consent, as coordinators, and as we as the IRB and reviewing research, we have to consider harms beyond just physical risks, but also privacy risks and social risks and emotional risks. And obviously this individual felt harmed by being observed. And so that's something that the IRB has to consider. One of the maybe the most surprising things along these lines that I've experienced is there's a longitudinal study that is going on here at UAB where participants are followed for years and years and years, and they get additional surveys and follow-ups year after year. They get visits to their homes, and so these participants know what's going on. They know they're part of this study. They're engaged in that. I've even had the spouse of a participant who passed away call me and just said, hey, this was important to my spouse. I know she would want you to know that she's passed away. So these are participants who are invested. But there was one particular sub-study that looked at socioeconomics and asked questions like, did you have enough food as a child? And we got probably 10 phone calls from participants about this. Participants very upset, participants who were crying on the phone because we were asking questions about that elicited painful memories from the past. And that was something the researchers had IRB approval. We had reviewed it. We had reviewed the consent process. Didn't see anything wrong with it. And that's one that we just missed. We didn't anticipate the harm there. But it goes to show the importance of that continuing consent process and fully disclosing, what is the purpose here and what are the procedures? What are these participants going to be experiencing in this? And that's somewhere where we might have failed in that. Because their questions were like, what does this have to do? What does my having not had enough food as a kid have to do with my risk in X now? And there was a very real reason that the investigators were asking these questions. We probably just failed to communicate that information to the participants on the front end so that they could say, no, you know what, I don't want to go there. I don't want to think about that. I don't want to answer these questions, and they could toss it in the trash. So think about that too, not just the physical risks, but the emotional risks, privacy risks. Other challenges, but you approved it last time. We get that from time to time. Things change. Be sure we try to, when we update our template consent form, to send out a listserv announcement. The listserv is something that we've created probably in the past couple of years. And so if you're not on that, we haven't sent out a lot of announcements. We try not to inundate you with those, but whenever we do a major update like the consent form on a form, we'll send out a listserv announcement there. Copying and pasting from other studies, we read it word for word, and if it's a full board study, 12 people read it word for word. And so if there are inconsistencies in there, we're going to catch them, and we have to fix those before we can approve the consent form. Consent forms passed down for generations. That's probably not as big an issue in this room as it is for some other areas that are heavy in student research, where one student gets something approved and they just share it everywhere. Probably the number one thing that you all can do to help you get your studies approved faster is read everything you submit to us before you submit it. And I know we all copy and paste and we use things, but you don't know how many consent forms that we get that are conducted by Wise Drug Company, Dr. Doe at 555 that's the language in our template consent form. So just, we all understand saving the last version, but read through what you're submitting to us, because it'll save us a lot of time. It'll help both of us if you can do that. I love this. Back to Facebook. This is something, a screenshot of his iPhone that my friend Owen posted on Facebook, and from his papa. And so Papa is writing my friend Owen, I love the last line on the introductory page of the survey. Should you have any questions regarding your rights and privileges as human subjects participants at X University, please contact the IRB at what does that even mean? I want to call that number and ask about my rights and privileges. I might get a better parking for ball games. So I hate to inform Owen's Papa, but we don't have any control over parking at ball games, at least not at the institutions where I've worked. But it does point out the importance of, all of us, including the IRB and our template language, using words that are understandable. You know, a lot of times I'll say, well, I recognize all those words individually, but put those things together, what does that mean? And so let's try to write things in a way that's going to be understandable to the participants. Another Henry Beecher quote, it is absolutely essential to strive for consent for moral, sociologic, and legal reasons. The statement that consent has been obtained has little meaning unless the subject or his guardian is capable of understanding what is to be undertaken, and unless all hazards are made clear. I hear stories, and it concerns me greatly, where a friend will go in to participate in a research study, and the coordinator will throw the consent form out on sign this, take it back, and they're done. Most recently, this happened just with a healthy control type study where the individual was just providing a biological specimen. It's a little physical risk there, but what's going to be done with those specimens? What's going to be attached in terms of identifiers? You know, it's imperative that we explain the research to the participants so that they understand, because it doesn't matter how many signatures you have on the form. If they don't understand, then you don't have consent. So tips, I wanted to give you some tips. Consent or protocol. Really, this isn't aimed at you. This is a question that I've asked my IRB colleagues, and it's probably maybe a 50-50 split on which one they start with when they're reviewing a study, whether they start with the consent form and read it first or start with the protocol. Now, obviously, you all are going to probably have to start with the protocol unless you get a template consent form, and you're going to have to write the consent. But my colleague, now, personally, I start with the protocol too, and read through that, and I want to make sure that everything's in the consent form. But a lot of my colleagues will start with the consent form first. And they say, if I don't understand the study from the consent form, then the consent form is not good enough. Because if you think about it, the participant's coming to the table, and that's all they're going to know. So you really should be able to get the whole picture of the protocol from the consent. Be sure to include all elements of consent, and those are defined. I'm not listing them here, but they're in the regulations at 46.116. The easiest way to do this, if there's not a template provided by the sponsor, start with our UAB IRB template. Just do change Wise Drug Company and Dr. No, and all of the other procedures as well. If there's a sponsor template, add the UAB specific elements. You don't have to put that in our format. You don't have to copy and paste it. You don't have to rearrange it and use the same headings that we use in our template consent form. My staff knows that if it means the same thing, if it's withdrawal instead of voluntary participation, we're not supposed to ask you to change that. And we have a large staff, but we try very hard for consistency among our staff members. We have regular what we call reviewing staff meetings, where all the reviewing staff get together and say, how are we handling this? How do you handle that? Here's a complaint I got. I just want to make sure that we're handling this consistently. And I've got at least two of my staff members here, Sally and Lisa, who can vouch for me there. We really do try to have consistency in our reviews. And I tell people, and I tell them that I'm telling people this, if you're getting inconsistent things, contact me or Leslie Cooper, the associate director, because we want to know if there's inconsistencies in the office. You're not getting somebody in trouble. We have so many people doing this, and we're humans. We make mistakes. Some of this is subjective. So if you're getting different stories from different people or different requests, or this contradicts what I was asked last time, give me or Leslie a call, or ask the staff person you're working with, hey, this doesn't really line up with what I was told last time, so that we can get on the same page internally. Because we know how frustrating it is for you all to be told different things and have to flip-flop around. It's also more work for us if we're pointing you in different directions. So let us know if we're being inconsistent. I'll be the first person to admit that does happen from time to time, but we try really hard not to. I put this little star down here because I meant to give you a warning before I went to that next page. We work off checklists in the office because there's no way in the world we can have all this information in our head. The next page is just the consent portion of our checklist, not meant to scare you. And I've even thought about providing these checklists for you to use if you want to. The problem with that is it's not going to mean a lot. You're not going to know what all of it means. Some of it's code, things that we know, but a lot of it is stuff that you can figure out by going through our template consent form. So, this is what we're going to do with your consent form when you give it to us. We're going to go through and all the bolded elements are things that come straight from the regulations. The italicized things come straight from the regulations. Other things are UAB specific things that are not necessarily the IRB's fault, I promise, Some things are, billing compliance. We just have to do this as an institution or we're going to get in trouble, and IRB gets the honor of being the one to check for that and asking you to include it. But this is what we're going to do. We have to make sure that all of these things line up so that our participants are protected and informed and the institution is protected. We have big issues, obviously beyond the ethical issues of an informed participant, but if we don't comply with all of this, we have a regulatory and compliance issue that we might have to report to the feds, and we don't want to do that. It's a lot of trouble for all of us, so we just want to make sure that all of this is in the consent process up front. Some other tips. 8th grade reading level are lower, as we mentioned before, the average for the general population, and not specific to Alabama or Birmingham, but they just say generally an average reading level is 8th grade. You're going to encounter people with less than that or not able to read at all. Should be relatively short. Don't throw anything at me. I know we continue to ask you to add things to it, but as my friend said earlier, if I was in that room any longer, I wouldn't have heard anything else anyway. So longer does not necessarily mean more informed. A lot of the times it means less informed because you can't retain all of that. So summarize, bullet points are great, whatever you can do to shorten it. Clearly, and these are not my tips, these are published findings of things that help with comprehension of consent forms. Clearly organized with subheadings, illustrations, and I'm going to get to a point about that in a second. Written in active voice and straightforward vocabulary. Don't use a lot of jargon. Don't use a lot of medical language. Don't use legalese in the consent form. This is meant for an information exchange with participants. So speaking of pictures, here's something that came from a consent form. I'm using this with permission from the investigator. I'm just going to read this to you. Both forms of training will make use of body weight support provided by the KineAssist device. The KineAssist is a robotic device that allows full freedom of motion for the body and pelvis during walking and balance tasks, and also helps to control your posture to enhance your balance and stability. The KineAssist also offers you safety while training will catch you if you lose your balance. This assistance is available while you are strapped into the device with a harness, and the device allows you to walk over the treadmill with minimal things affecting your walking. That's a lot of words. And I'm a gadget guy. I know pre-orders for the Apple Watch start a week from tomorrow. And so when I read this, I was picturing something like, y'all remember the really old version of RoboCop and the bad RoboCop? I was picturing something like that with big things that strap on the legs. Here's what it actually looks like when we saw a picture of it. Now, seeing that, do you have a better idea of what the KineAssist is versus all those words that we just read? So take advantage of that. We want you to use pictures, tables, whatever you can do to better convey the information to participants. If it needs to be, if the diagram, the illustration that you need needs to be colored, and you're doing black and white copies of the consent form, it can be separate from that, and you can just refer to it in the consent form. Then the consent form needs to include all of the basic and additional elements of consent that are defined in the regulations, but it can be, the KineAssist is a device that's going to help you to walk without falling. See the attached picture. The consent form needs to describe everything, but it doesn't have to describe it just using words. You can refer to the picture. And that picture can be appended to or separate from, so that you can print that in color, separate from the black and white consent form, or whatever you need to do. Remember, the consent is a process, not a form, and recruitment is part of the consent process. And that's not our rule, that's the Fed's rule. That's why you need to have your recruitment flyers approved by the IRB before you put them out, because that's the first point of information exchange with your participants. When you're posting something on the bulletin board, or when you're calling somebody to ask them to participate in the study, or when there's an ad running on the television screen, that's our first information exchange with participants. So it's considered part of the consent process. It's part of that information that goes to them that helps them make an informed decision about whether or not they want to participate. Consider new technologies. It doesn't just have to be a paper form. Now, obviously, there have to be resources for this, but we've had some studies that have used consent processes on iPads, and the participant actually signs the iPad with their finger or a stylus. There are issues there. if you're dealing with FDA, there's Part 11 compliance with electronic signatures and all that. OHRP does say that electronic can be used if it complies with local laws. The consent has to be written and signed unless we remember the elements of consent are separate from the documentation of consent, so it might be that the IRB can waive documentation, and so you just present the information on the iPad or tablet. But both can be electronic if it's made available in a form that can be retained. So if it's something that all your participants have an email address, and you can either hit email a copy to them and they get a copy, or if they don't have an email, you hit print and it prints out. It just has to be in a manner that they can keep it and you can keep a copy, and that it can be presented to our federal regulatory agencies if they come in for an audit. So, you can think about different approaches to get this information across to your participants that will help both you and them. I wanted to give you a couple of resources. One is, how do we increase comprehension with our participants and retention? And one of those is something called the teach back method, where you ask participants to explain in their own words what's been described to them. That enhances both short-term and long-term recall. But don't wait until the end. Don't go through a 20-page consent form and then say, so what did you think about that, or did you understand? So compare the difference in these. Tell me in your own words the purpose of the study versus do you understand? So if we think back to the oncology study that I mentioned before, if you went through the whole 20 pages and then you ask this question, tell me about the purpose. Well, if they get it wrong, if it's to cure me, then you've got to go all the way back to the front. But if you stop after the purpose section, you explain the purpose section. And by the way, don't read it to them. But if you don't want to read it to them, they don't want to be read to, they're not going to listen. They're going to listen, but they're not going to hear. So just explain, have a conversation with them. What's the purpose? And then say, tell me in your own words what the purpose is. And if they miss a point, then you can correct that then, you can address that and have that conversation then, and help them to get it and retain it. And so do that for each section. The other thing I wanted to mention to you is NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, has teamed up with a couple of different institutions. I'm part of a working group that these institutions are also part of, and they've compiled informed consent language, an informed consent language database, so that you can go here, if you're not really sure how to describe something, you can go here and say, what does the NCCN database have for this? So that we don't have 19 different ways of describing the risks of an MRI. So feel free to use this as a resource to pull information from if you're assembling your own consent form. Obviously, if you get something from the sponsor, use that, and we're not requiring this language by any stretch, but this is a resource for you. It's free. It doesn't require registration or anything. You just have to click a license agreement and use your license agreement to proceed into it. And then you can search by different procedures or conditions, etc. That's all I've got. We've got plenty of time for questions. Do you have any questions for me? Yes.
This is silly, it's probably on the website, but if a person can't write, is that after my sign consent?
I think so, yeah. That's what we do. Yeah. That's their mark. So, yeah.
I think it's important to remember that they don't have to sign it right then. Years ago when I was in a study, we provided like a little note sheet on the back of our consent form or something like that, and allowed them to kind of take down notes.